Do we start at the very beginning?
Let's start at the beginning. We're going to start at the beginning.
You're going to do the song and the bit?
I'm going to do the song and the bit.
All right.
All right.
Do your song bit.
I'm going to song and dance, baby.
And 3, a 2, a 1.
Hi, Tina.
Hi, Leah. How's it going?
It's going really well. I realized that this is episode 13 of the Cancer Pod.
Whoa.
No, I'm going with lucky number 13. This is not going to be like the elevator does not have the 13th floor. We are owning it. We are embracing it. I feel lucky.
All right. I generally feel lucky. So, yeah, I'm in.
All right. Cool. But before we get started on our episode, I wanted to bring up the song. I never announced our unofficial theme song for this pod.
All right. What's our official theme song?
Well, it's that song that I played for you earlier, the kind of R&B pub rock.
I liked it.
It was really good. And it's actually going through my head right now. And so hopefully other people like it. It's by a band called Dr. Feelgood, and it's called Down at the Doctor.
All right. You going to hum a few bars or something?
No, I really want to, but I'm going to spare everybody. They can tune into our Spotify playlist if they want to hear the song and the other songs that we have chosen for our unofficial theme songs.
All right.
But just kind of covering what we have discussed in this pod, since this is the third episode of the Talk to Your Doctor pod, we have covered how to talk to your doctor about integrative medicine.
Yep.
We talked about things that you can mention at your appointment, what to bring to your appointment, those kinds of things that you would ask your doctor at various appointments. Not necessarily your first, but it could be for someone who is recently diagnosed. It could be beneficial. And now we're going to talk about genetics.
Yeah. When to talk to your doctor about genetics and genetic tendencies and whether you have a hereditary cancer or a likelihood of a hereditary cancer. You don't know until you test. So yeah, just a little primer on that to see if it's appropriate or not.
And this isn't testing the genetics of a tumor. That is something that is different. This is a test to check for family history if there's some sort of tie.
Yes, this is what you inherit. So this is the genes you got from mom and dad, and it's in the nucleus of every cell in your body. And so we're going to talk about when is it appropriate? When should it be brought up? Do not always assume that it will be brought up by your doctor. I will say, having done this for a long time, that we've come a long way. So when we used to look for just a single mutation before, now they'll do a whole broad swath of mutations relevant for that particular cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So we've come a long way and it's become more commonplace, but it's still not so commonplace that it's always brought up. So it is something that people need to be aware of and maybe even advocate for when appropriate.
And I was tested when I was diagnosed because I was under 50 when I was diagnosed. And so that in itself is an indication for getting tested. And my test came back negative. They did the BRCA testing.
And at that time, did they only test for the BRCA 1 and 2? Or did they test for others?
No, at that time, that's all they tested. It wasn't until my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer that they came back and said, well, let's run some more tests. And that's when they ran the Ovanex test. And those all came back negative as well.
So you don't have any genetic mutations?
Any known genetic mutations, yeah.
Right. Key word, any known genetic mutations. Yeah. Right. We're still learning. Yeah, they're still amassing the information, and over time, they learn more. So right now, the common statistic that's bantered about is that about 10% of all cancers are due to heritable known genetic mutation or deletion of a gene. So 90% of all cancers out there are what are called sporadic cancers, or they arise without any known genetic mutation or deletion. That said, when people have a known gene in their family, there's a lot of variability as to how much that lends more risk for that person. And it's highly dependent on which gene we're talking about. So all cancers can be seen as a combination of genetics and the environment. And when I say the environment, I'm not talking about our planet. I'm talking about the cellular environment.
Mm-hmm.
So how the gene and its environment, cellular environment, interact. And when people have a inherited genetic mutation, basically you can think of it like a head start. Their genetics make for a head start towards that cancer. You still need the influences of the cellular environment to be such that cancer finally happens.
So just because you have tested positive or this gene is present, it doesn't mean that, like my analogy is always like the switch necessarily doesn't get flipped on.
Right. When we're talking about hereditary cancers in general, we're talking about what is called penetrance. That's the technical term for like how much risk does this give me? So if 8 out of 10 women with a given BRCA mutation end up getting breast cancer, it's highly penetrant. I mean, it penetrates through and it goes from genotype, what that looks like on their genes, to what we call a phenotype, what they actually manifest as an organism, as a human being. So that's highly penetrant. And that's one of the reasons that we all know BRCA, and not to mention famous people coming out and talking about it. And it's fairly prevalent. I mean, and it's kind of the prototypical one that I talk to people about because they're familiar with it. You know, Angelina Jolie came out, talked about it years ago. 1 out of 400 women estimated have a mutation or deletion in this gene. And I shouldn't discount men because it does add to prostate cancer risk. Some of these are linked to pancreatic cancer risk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the BRCA mutation is not solely in women. If someone is of Jewish descent, particularly Eastern European Jewish
Ashkenazi,
descent.
yeah. That's why they were like really into testing me too.
Yeah. So that's 1 in 40 women as opposed to 1 in 400. And that's why the criteria for testing, if someone is Ashkenazi Jewish descent and they have a cancer, oftentimes it'll be tested. I mean, right now it should be tested. Mm-hmm. But again, they don't test just for BRCA anymore. So they'll do a whole panel of other genes that are involved or inherited that raise risk. And most of those genes do not have that kind of penetrance of 80% or 60%. A lot of others have 20%, 25%. And it's still a lot. It's still, enough for the person to be concerned about and concerned about their family members. Back to that genetic counselor, I'm going to keep going back to that. This is the reason that genetic counselors are brought on, is not just to do the scientific aspect and say, what's appropriate? What do we test? What does your history? And the history that we refer to, just the terminology is called pedigree. I know it's kind of funny because we use it for dogs and animals. But the genetic counselor will, those circles and squares where you go down the family tree and you say who had whatever condition, that is called a pedigree, and you will work that out with a genetic counselor. And then that genetic counselor decides what should we test for, given your family history, if it's applicable. They know all of the possible heritable cancer syndromes out there, and there's a lot of them.
There is hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, which that's the BRCA 1 or 2. And that's the one that you said also may predispose you to other cancers like pancreatic or prostate cancer.
Yeah. Another common one is Lynch syndrome. Lynch is often tested in people with colorectal cancer, probably most commonly.
There's Fraumeni syndrome. That one, a person can actually have the risk of developing more than one cancer. It's a mutation of the TP53 gene. And they're often very young when they're diagnosed. And the cancer risk includes like sarcomas, breast cancer, brain cancers, leukemias.
Yeah, and there is the P10 mutation, which is also involved in Cowden syndrome. That's commonly tested in women when they're getting that panel for breast cancer. That's going to be included on there. It's also linked with thyroid cancers and urinary tract cancers, as well as endometrial cancer, which might be better known as uterine cancer.
Yeah. And I mean, there are other familial cancers that might predispose somebody to melanoma.
So for people who are considering, is this appropriate, isn't it appropriate, talking to your doctor about whether it's appropriate and emphasizing your own family history, might be important. So if you yourself say, oh gosh, I can think of aunts, uncles, grandparents, siblings, nieces, nephews, all these people in your family who have a cancer history, it's good for you to have all of that information and be very precise on your medical chart so that the medical doctors can see it, but also maybe bring that and say, is it appropriate for me to see a genetic counselor? There's nothing wrong with talking to someone. If you're concerned, then talking to a genetic counselor seems like a good idea. And if the genetic counselor says, well, there's very little reason to test you because of whatever reasons, they don't believe that it's appropriate, you can at least have some peace of mind, right? But if you have an extensive family history, there's a good chance they're going to want to test you, especially, like you said, if you're younger than 50, usually.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I often remember speaking with patients who would say they were recently diagnosed with colorectal cancer, and they would talk about their family history and how they had many immediate relatives who also had been diagnosed at one point with colorectal cancer. And the oncologist would have them tested for Lynch syndrome.
Yeah. And that, just as an aside for that, if someone has a family history, especially primary family members, siblings, parents, I would even say grandparents, and that family member had a colorectal cancer diagnosis under the age of 50, you yourself should be getting a colonoscopy much, much sooner than general guidelines. Because the general guidelines right now are colonoscopies for screening at the age of 45 when there is no family history of colorectal cancer and no high risk. So I just want to put that out there, because I think when we're talking about hereditary cancers and you're looking back and you say, my grandmother was diagnosed at 46, then you shouldn't be waiting until you're 45 or 50 to get a colonoscopy. You need to go in much sooner.
Right. And yeah, it's the same with prostate cancer patients, where if somebody in their family was diagnosed at a younger age, then they start their screening even younger than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about penetrance, and that has to do with how likely that genetic mutation leads to an actual cancer. Prevalence is another thing. If it's highly prevalent, it's more likely to be tested for. So prevalence means how many people have that mutation out there in the world. As the cost comes down and we can screen a lot more genes all at the same time, which is happening now, there will probably come a time where we just screen at a certain age or screen with a certain history without an actual cancer diagnosis in that individual having to happen. Right now, that's not very common. It's usually the person with cancer that should be tested because they develop the cancer, so they're the most likely to be carrying the genetic mutation.
Right.
There may come a day where, because of technology, it becomes as simple as a blood test or a saliva test, because if we're talking about DNA, you don't need to use blood. That's in all of the cells of your body, so you could use the cells off of the inside of your cheeks, your buccal mucosa in there.
As we know from anyone who's done Ancestry.com or 23andMe, and you have to spit in a vial.
Yeah, that's a good point. So here's the thing. 23andMe, so they had on their test, they did have some BRCA mutations on their test, but they only had 3 possibilities. All 3 of them were found in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. So that was the heritage for those 3 mutations, as opposed to there's other mutations in other ethnicities.
Mm-hmm.
They're called founder mutations. Mm-hmm. When they go back in history and they can see, oh, this mutation began in Holland, or that mutation began in Poland, or that mutation began in Italy. And those founder mutations are, they're in other populations. 23andMe only was looking for 3 out of dozens and dozens of different BRCA mutations that are possible. And so one thing that happened, I remember when this was popular and people were like, oh, good, I don't have that. I had to do a lot of unwinding of that assumption and say, well, actually, you didn't really get tested for this mutation because it wasn't a thorough test at all. So this kind of dovetails right into the whole idea of these test kits go into people's houses, and, people are sending test kits, and you take a little cheek swab and you send it back in. There are companies doing this. I don't recommend it. I think that genetic counselors, for many reasons, should be part of this whole process. I don't think people should just be going online and paying for it. One, technology varies dramatically, and you may or may not be doing a thorough test. So that's the first reason, is it may or may not be valid. But the second reason is you may need someone to talk to kind of work through the implications of a positive test.
Oh, I remember when 23andMe first came out, they would tell you everything. Like they don't tell you anything. They'll tell you if you like have a gene where you could smell asparagus in your pee now. I mean, they don't go very deep, but when they first came out, they told you everything. They told you like your possible risks. And so a colleague of mine, when I was in my residency, took the test, and it was like 23andMe day, and he ordered the test. He was really excited to find out what would come back. And when he got the answers, even though it isn't the same, it's not your destiny, but it just talks about all of your risks for all these different diseases. He was not happy. He kind of like wished he hadn't opened up Pandora's box.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's before I don't know if they were completely bought or it was just a heavy investment from GlaxoSmithKline, GSK. So they're now mostly owned by a pharmaceutical company as far as I know.
Oh.
And I think that's changed a lot of things.
I think they got in trouble because I think it was something where they got in trouble for like giving that much information.
Yeah. I did 23andMe.
And?
I did it under a pseudonym.
Okay. Smart.
Right. Because I'm adequately paranoid. It was interesting. Here's the thing about gene testing and genes.
Did you do it back in the day or did you do it recently?
Back in the day.
Years? Back in the day where they tell you everything.
They told you everything. And there were several other outside websites where you could take the information and crunch the data and they would come back and say, here's what we see. So they would help you interpret it. And of course, I would go online and look at it myself, the various genetic findings. Here's the thing. Now, I come from a biochemistry background, molecular biology background. So I happen to know that there's a lot of redundancy in genes, and the idea of reducing it down to this simple test and saying this is your risk for cataracts or Parkinson's or whatever, it is such a massive oversimplification. I mean, I think that's why they tightened it up and started to say, here, yes, you can smell asparagus, or you cilantro's nasty to you, but it tastes good to you. I mean, they're sticking with some
the heavy hitting stuff. They're really like, the stuff we need to know. I did not know that was a gene about the asparagus pea, but there you go.
Yeah.
My life is so much better because of it.
I think they reined it in because they were extrapolating the information and making claims that were definitely not rigorous scientifically. So I think that it's good that they reined it in, to be perfectly honest. What they're doing now is probably more in keeping with being responsible with the information than they were back in the day when they were telling you, how much your risk of Alzheimer's is going to be and such.
Right.
With inadequate data. Right.
Right. So we talked about age being a factor, but then there also are genetic mutations that are more for people of older ages too.
Well, yeah, what this speaks to is a lot of these mutations are a problem in repairing the DNA. So unbeknownst to all of us, all day long, our cells are renewing. There's mitotic processes and DNA is being created in that process. And it's, picture kind of a zipper, right? And when the zipper gets stuck, there's something that comes along and makes sure that it gets unstuck. Or something gets in the zipper and the DNA repair mechanism comes along and says, oh, wait, let's fix that up. And then it stops for a moment, repairs it, and goes on. When people have a mutation in a gene having to do with DNA repair, there's a glitch in that mechanism. And so sometimes mistakes happen in the DNA and then they accumulate over time. And so one of the things that happens with some of these DNA repair mechanisms gone awry, over time when you're aging, the DNA repair mechanisms normally are less robust than they are when you are young. So aging together with a DNA repair glitch culminates in higher and higher risks with every year and every decade of life. So they'll go through their 20s and 30s and be fine, and their 40s, their 50s, and certainly their 60s. Then it's too much. There's an accumulation in DNA damage, and that eventually leads to cancer.
So at what point is a person tested? Is this early on? I know we kind of discussed a little bit about the factors that might lead you to be tested, but just kind of walk us through, when do you see a genetic counselor? When do you get tested? All of that.
Yeah, I think some of this has to do with people's individual scenario, right? Do they want to apprise their children or their siblings? They might need to be more aggressive about screening, for example. So that might prompt you to do it sooner than later. The American Society of Clinical Oncology recommends that genetic testing be done after you speak to a genetic counselor. And I think that's a really good idea because the genetic counselor may know other tests that should be done, a broader array of tests, for example. And as I mentioned, if the test is positive, you have that counselor in place to speak with and say, who else should be tested? What should we be looking for? What are the screening procedures for my family members if that test comes back with any genetic mutations or deletions? So that's a really important person to have. And, establishing that relationship and getting that testing done sooner than later makes sense to me, unless you're going through the midst of treatment and you just don't have the time and energy for it. Obviously, sooner is better, probably, if you've already made the decision to go that direction.
So what you're actually going to be asking for is, can I speak with a genetic counselor as opposed to, can I get genetic testing?
Yeah, I think that's the most appropriate question. Yeah. I was doing some reading before we talked, and MD Anderson is the one that had a hotline that people can call, and we can put that in our show notes so people can self-refer to that phone number, that service at MD Anderson.
Okay. That's great. Yeah, we'll put that in there.
Yeah, and since, we're advocating for people to be active participants in their own care and do this and reach out and talk to a genetic counselor, I'm going to go through the official list of signs that cancer may be hereditary.
Okay.
We've mentioned several of them. So if you're diagnosed young, if you're under the age of 50, genetic counselor should be consulted with. If there's multiple people from the same side of the family having the same or even related cancers, and I would even say disparate cancers, just if there's a bunch of people on your father's side or your mother's side and you know that there's a lot of cancer on one side of the family, that should prompt you to go regardless of your age. If you've had more than one cancer, so if you've had 2 different cancers or more, we've already mentioned breast and ovarian cancer syndrome in young people and people of Jewish descent. If someone has multiple polyps in their colon, so if you go get a screening colonoscopy, now generally the gastroenterologist is going to say something, but just for the record, that also prompts a genetic counselor to be consulted with. And if you have certain rare cancers, things that aren't common, so breast cancer in a male, for example,
right.
Every gentleman with breast cancer should get tested. Retinoblastomas, medullary thyroid cancers, and some of the neuroendocrine cancers. Some neuroendocrine cancers that could be adrenal gland, it could be other endocrine glands, but those should always be prompted to a genetic counselor because they're not very common, and there are syndromes that are involved with endocrine cancers. And then if a family member tests positive, so if you have any family members who test positive for a hereditary cancer, genetic mutation or deletion, then you should consider it for your own self. But again, the genetic counselor needs to be part of this so you can make that decision fully informed. Is this something you want to know? And what are you going to do about it afterwards as far as taking measures for prevention and screening if it comes up positive? So those are the official recommendations. I should mention there's a National Society of Genetic Counselors. And the National Society of Genetic Counselors has a website. They have a phone number. We can put those in our show notes.
I'm making a note right now.
Their website is simple because it's nsgc.org. So it's National Society of Genetic Counselors. It's abbreviation .org.
When I was diagnosed and they were talking to me about, I saw a genetic counselor and I was tested for BRCA1 and BRCA2. I remember my sister kept asking, do I need to get tested? Do I need to get tested? And she didn't. In fact, they said, had I come back positive, then she could get tested. Her daughter could get tested. But yeah, it kind of like saved her a step of having to get tested.
That's interesting. And then how about your mother? Did she get tested?
Not at that time. No.
Okay.
No, she didn't have any genetic testing until, no, I don't even know if she got the genetic testing when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer.
Okay.
I'm assuming she did. Maybe it was just me. I actually don't remember much from that time, but.
I mean, that brings up a good point, and that is if there are multiple cancers in a family tree, I mean, you want to go higher up the tree if you possibly can, because then you'd be going upwards to the source. So if your mother was tested and came out positive, then it would prompt testing your sister possibly.
Yeah. And I'm a weird case because there was no family history of cancer other than a cousin on my mom's side. One of my cousins on my mom's side was diagnosed at a young age with breast cancer. But my father, my mom, and I all had cancer at the exact same time. So we weren't really a family tree. We were like a family, like a knot in a family tree. All three of us had cancer and we did not know. The three of us all had cancer at the same time.
Yeah, that is really unusual.
And then they kept going, asking questions about the Ashkenazi Jewish heritage of my father's side of the family. And there were no known cancers in his family. And I'm saying no known cancers because back in the day, they didn't talk about cancer, it was whispered. So that was another weird thing. But yeah, three of us had three completely unrelated cancers all at the same time.
Yeah. Wow. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between genes that you inherit and what is really popular in natural medicine and integrative medicine and in just the world of nutrition, and that is epigenetics.
Right. That's a hot word.
Yes, it is. Well, because we do inherit epigenetics from our mothers, fathers, grandparents. And epigenetics are literal. Epi means away from or next to. It's above, sometimes it's called, but it's not genetic. It's not the actual code of the DNA. It is the mechanisms that allow for those genes to be either expressed or not expressed, turned on or turned off. So epigenetics is much more fluid. It's a much more dynamic process. Epigenetics is definitely more malleable through our habits and what we do on a day-to-day, how we sleep, how we eat, our attitudes, prayer and meditation affects epigenetics. Mm-hmm. There's all these pieces of the epigenetic puzzle that we do that have to do with our lifestyle and diet. And that's why epigenetics is so talked about in our circles of natural and integrative medicine. And it's totally separate from what we're talking about today. We're talking about the actual code, the A, C, T, and G that make up the gene itself. This is the 4 nucleotides that make up the genetic code. Those are what we're talking about when we talk about gene testing and genetic predispositions for these hereditary cancers. And that's very different. That's, like I said, that's more of a hardwiring, where epigenetics would be more of a software, right?
So what are other implications? I mean, there could be changes in how cancer is treated.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting ones is the PARP inhibitors for ovarian cancer that have been developed. They're being used more broadly now. One of the reasons they work really well in those with, for example, the BRCA mutations is that I mentioned that many of these mutations have to do with a defect in the DNA repair mechanisms. We talk about chemo killing and drugs killing and radiation killing, but really, a lot of times in cancer care, the cells are killing themselves. What we're doing with our conventional medicines in particular is creating enough damage that the cell makes that cell destruction decision. If I can anthropomorphize a cell, so they're making a decision. Well, they turn on their self-destruction pathways because there's no way to go forward. Damage to the DNA is so catastrophic that there is no way to carry forward. So it will then turn on its cell destruction pathways. And that's what, for example, the PARP inhibitor class of drugs does. And so I think that's the most interesting thing is like, well, if it was a 3-legged stool and it was sitting up on 2 legs, the PARP inhibitor would be the equivalent of coming along and knocking another leg off.
Right.
And now the stool has to fall over. That's basically what that whole idea is. And I thought that was kind of a clever way of using that mutation to your advantage.
Yeah, that's actually really fascinating. And I have a friend who was diagnosed at a very young age with breast cancer, and she was found to have Fraumeni syndrome. And it was found at a certain point where she was planning on getting radiation. When they found out that she had the syndrome, they said, no radiation, because I believe it predisposes to the other cancers like sarcomas and thyroid cancer. There are other cancers that if you have the syndrome, it can predispose you to getting. Mm-hmm. So that kind of changed her treatment plan.
That's a good reason to get it done as soon as possible as well.
Yeah, because it could possibly change how your treatment is managed.
One thing I want to make sure I mention from a practical note, there is a really good nonprofit out there called Facing Hereditary Cancer Empowered, FORCE. I think they have the most user-friendly and thorough website on this topic that is easily accessible, and they make it very palatable and go through all of the things that we're talking about, but in much, much more detail. And then they go into about clinical research trials and risk management when you do have a hereditary cancer mutation or deletion. So I think that's one resource that's a great place to start. They're also involved in the NCCN guidelines that are being revised constantly. They're on the advisory board for that.
Yeah. And so that website is facingourrisk.org. And I will put that up on our show notes.
Perfect.
Other implications could be how frequently somebody goes back for follow-up appointments. You might need to be monitored more closely. There could be additional surgeries, such as a hysterectomy with an oophorectomy, having your ovaries removed as well. There could be additional procedures that need to be done, maybe getting a colonoscopy at an earlier age, all of those types of things. So there definitely are many reasons why this information is important to know.
Yeah, the chance of it coming up in most people is low, right? So we still have 10% of people having some kind of genetic mutation or deletion involved in the cancer diagnosis. So if you're just looking at the numbers, the vast majority of cancers that develop in people do not have any identifiable familial genetic mutation or deletion. Certainly 80%, 90%, depending on the cancer, have nothing that we can put our finger on and say, oh, it's that gene. So I just want to make sure we emphasize that over and over, because when you talk about genetic mutation, that sounds like, that must be part of the cancer, because we know that the cancer itself has genetic
mutations,
changes.
Right? Yeah.
But those are usually what we call sporadic mutations, meaning they happened in that tissue. Sporadic mutations account for most cancers out there, and that's totally separate from what we're talking about. And I'm just going to repeat that. We started with that, but I'm going to end with that too, because I think it's a really essential point to understand when you're asking for this kind of testing. We're talking about hereditary, not tumor-based testing.
And I think another good point to end on is that if a person comes back and they're found to be positive for one of these hereditary cancers, in terms of like having the genetics, maybe they themselves have not been diagnosed. It's not something that's set in stone. It's not, like we said, it's not your destiny.
Right.
So if a family member has cancer, if you have cancer and it is found to be a hereditary cancer, it's not set in stone that your children will inherit this.
Right.
Or that it will manifest into a cancer.
Right. And we didn't go into all of the details, but again, that website, Facing Hereditary Cancer Empowered, has all the details about how these are inherited. Is it autosomal dominant? Is it autosomal recessive? All this kind of technicalities that might be interesting to some people out there that want to know the details of this.
Yeah. And I do know that there's conversation around, I have daughters, I want to get tested for my children, or there's fear of, having children tested as well. And so just knowing that this is not a definitive.
Yeah. And you know what? That brings up another point that I want to just put at the very end here. And that is the practicality of insurance, health insurance and life insurance, how this information is treated by health insurance companies and life insurance companies has changed over time. The genetic counselor will be up to date. So I am not even going to propose to know right now, but I can tell you that there was a time that life insurance could be refused. And I don't know if that's still the case anymore. That was years ago. And so hopefully that's changed since. But talk to the genetic counselor about those really practical, logistical questions of, going forward, will this affect any of my healthcare?
That's a really good point. Well, I guess if this is the end of our Talk to Your Doctor pod, then this is time for our moment of woo.
I love the moment of woo.
Well, I do too. And I had a really hard time finding woo. So
I know. Yeah. What's woo about talking to your doctor? There's not a lot.
I guess we could have done Talk to Your Doctor about woo woo, but shoot, why didn't I think of that? Well, what I decided to do was I was going to do a little myth busting. So most of us, when we're in school, in science class or whatever, we learn about Watson and Crick, and they discovered the double helix, which is the shape of DNA, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what many people don't know is it was actually a scientist. Her name was Rosalind Franklin, and she was a British scientist, She was a physicist and a chemist. She initially started working in coal and looking at the structure of coal. And that led her to working with viruses, with RNA viruses like the tobacco mosaic virus. And she worked in a lab with another scientist. His last name was Wilkins. And there was some sort of a conflict, and he left and he went to another lab where he worked with Watson and Crick. Rosalind Franklin was an X-ray crystallographer, which is kind of a cool title to have. And she had images of DNA that he shared with Watson and Crick. And that's how they came up with their discovery. It was based on her images. And it wasn't until after she died at the age of 37 from ovarian cancer, it wasn't until after her death that Crick acknowledged her contribution.
Yeah, and they got the Nobel Prize, right?
Yeah, and they ended up getting all of the accolades for this. So you were telling me that you were listening to a podcast through Scientific American?
Yeah. Science Talk, I think the name of their podcast is. And on there's a brand new podcast. It's kind of a spin-off called The Lost Women of Science. And it's all about stories like this, I think. I think it's the women who made discoveries and then got lost in the shadows because, well, someone else stepped up into the spotlight, and it was generally male counterparts that got all the credit, and their name got lost to history. So there's a new podcast by Scientific American called The Lost Women of Science. I'm kind of excited to listen to it.
Yeah, so this wasn't a moment of woo. We can call this like a moment of BS.
Okay. The BS meter pegs.
So, yeah, that was definitely a load of BS because, yeah, she was an incredibly intelligent woman who did a lot of good and didn't get the credit.
There are a lot of women of science who are definitely not heard of now. So, yeah, that could be a whole nother podcast. Oh, wait, it is The Lost Women of Science.
That's right. We don't have to do it ourselves. Thank goodness. Oh, so as always, remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you may listen to podcasts. Like, rate, review, comment, whatever it is that one does. And share
this with your friends. I mean, I think if you find this information useful, hopefully entertaining as well, but especially useful, send it on to your friends or loved ones that you think it might be relevant for. And that way we will spread the word, help more people.
That's right. It's like that old school commercial. You tell two friends and they tell two friends and so on and so on and so on. So on that note, I'm Dr. Leah Sherman.
And I'm Dr. Tina Kaiser.
And this is the Cancer Pod.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the Cancer Pod. Remember to subscribe, review, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media for updates. And as always, this is not medical advice. These are our opinions. Talk to your doctor before changing anything related to your treatment plan. The Cancer Pod is hosted by me, Dr. Leah Sherman, and by Dr. Tina Kaiser. Music is by Kevin MacLeod. See you next time.